Hello, this is Mary Kole and the Good Story podcast. And today with me, I am so excited to welcome author Leslie C. Youngblood, who has joined me. Leslie, if you don't mind, can you tell listeners, readers, writers, our audience a little bit about yourself?
Yes, thank you, Mary, for having me. Good Story Company. I really do appreciate it. I am Leslie C. Youngblood. I am the author of two middle grade novels, Love Like Sky, that was originally published by Disney Hyperion and later sold to Little Brown for young readers. And also my second novel, Forever This Summer, which just published July of 2021. So it's like a new baby book. It's not that old. So that is my newest book. And those are Forever This Summer is the sequel to Love Like Sky. And I have an MFA from UNC Greensboro. I really enjoyed that experience. And I'm just here to tell you what I know.
I love it. And I did notice on your website, July 6th was your publication date, which is actually my birthday. I'm also
Oh, wow.
a little baby. 29 forever is what I am. Your book, a little bit newer than that. I love it. So one of the things that I noticed right away is though you have written these two middle grade books, you say on your website, I'm not so much a fan of categories. And that was one of the things I asked you before we got started. I said, well, do you want to be introduced as a middle grade author, just an author? Of course, there's no just about it, right?
There's no just. No, never.
So tell us about this reluctance to be put in a category, even when somebody would see your two middle grade books and say, "Oh, she writes middle grade." What are you thinking with that?
Well, first, I absolutely love middle grade. And so to be called a middle grade author is an honor. But prior to being published in middle grade, I was also writing women's lit. So those are, I'm familiar with that category as well. So it becomes, I guess, what I'm noticing, it becomes what you first published as is what people want to categorize you as. And my ideal with that is I'm a writer that whatever voice comes to me, that is what I want to write. So if I've written five, middle grade novels and I get an idea or a voice comes to me and the voice of a 13-year-old that will put me in middle grade. If a voice comes to me as a 30-something-year-old woman, that will put me in women's lit. So I just want to be true to the voices and true to the stories I want to tell more so than following anyone's genre.
That's a really fair point. And I do think that sometimes people feel pigeonholed. They publish in a category, Well, can you make a move to young adult? Can you make a move to picture book, to women's fiction, to literary fiction? Sometimes publishing can be a little inflexible. They want to see a track record in a certain category, they want to see some branding. Do you have, are you making tracks to other categories right now?
Not well. I'm always making tracks with things I'm drafting. I could be working on a thriller. No one knows. Doesn't mean it's gonna publish. But what I do is the next story that I'm going to tell will be middle grade. But it really becomes when it took so long to publish. I've been on this publishing journey maybe 15 years before I published. So when that is your story, why would I let anyone box me in? Even though, keep in mind, I love middle grade. If I did not publish anything but middle grade, then I'm fine. As long as I know that this is what I want to do and the stories I want to tell, and I'm not someone who really is writing middle grade longing to write something else. It's not that. When I get that urge, I'll write that. So that is where I am with that right now. And I think that long as you love the stories you're telling, you're fine. But if you think that you want to explore another genre and you feel pigeonholed, you need to break out of that because this is our passion. This is definitely mine. and what I love to do. So I want to make sure that I'm happy and I'm true to the story. I just don't want to crank stuff out, you know.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about how you got to this point. And I think one of the things that listeners will find very inspiring is that you did have a bit of a journey to get here. So can you tell us about those 15 years and what you did, what you discarded, what you might pick back up again, the MFA process,
Oh,
any of
so
it?
much. I let me see. Such a long journey. I started writing short stories. So if you Google me, you probably will find a few short stories that I've written. So I thought I would first be published as a short story writer, a collection of interlinked stories. So I was really big on doing that. And when I thought about an MFA, I had a nice cushy job in Atlanta at Morehouse College, and I kept reading short stories and everything, and every bio. And here's a tip: read the bios, and read the acknowledgement of any writer that you admire, because it tells you so much. So every time I would read the acknowledgement sections, I would hear, the writers would mention their MFA, and I said, let me look into that. So, I did that, and I was fortunate to get an offer to attend UNC Greensboro. So that was a blessing. So I did that, and worked on literary fiction, because let me tell you, at that point, this was over, 10, 15 years ago, maybe more. And at that point, no, well, I don't know. It wasn't that long before I finished my MFA. At that point, I don't think that I didn't produce any stories with a middle grade voice. It's like when you're in an MFA program. At that point, it was before the popularity of children's literature. So I don't even know if there was an established program that I could have, received an MFA in children's lit. And there's a ton of them now. So when you're in that MFA program, no one usually presents children's voices that fit middle grade. Of course, that varies, because you can't have a children, a young voice, but it's adult, like Bastard out of Carolina, Toni Morrison. So once I decided to write, let me back up and tell this story. Okay, this is when I really said writing is for me. I was actually in my 20s. A lot of people think that every writer started, out of the womb writing. I loved writing. I loved listening to stories, but because of my background, my mom being a single parent, I wasn't one. I had things to do. I couldn't really, not that people that loved to read when they were young did not, but it wasn't really encouraged as much as grabbing my siblings and getting in front of the TV so we can just, entertain ourselves. So when I was in my 20s, I was a receptionist at a government agency in Atlanta, Georgia. So I'm sitting there and I'm reading, and I think I'm reading like, what am I reading at the time? I forgot. So I'm reading these novels and doing homework. And a woman named Nettie, she was a secretary, I was a receptionist. She came to my desk and she says, "Hey, I have a book that I think you may like, And I'm thinking, okay, I'll take a look. The book was James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain, which I have right up there on my bookcase. She gives me this book, Mary. I read this book for the rest of my shift. The next day, I changed my major from marketing to writing with a concentration in creative writing.
Oh my goodness.
The next day. So to say a book changed my life is honest. So from that point, that's when I went from loving to write to I have to do this. What the emotions that I felt when I read Baldwin, I needed to make people feel that when I wrote something, and I wanted to do that. And since then, it's been on to writing short stories, writing essays, and finally onto my MFA program. And then from there, maybe about 4 or 5 novels that may see the light of day one day, or maybe not. Um,
Yep.
I do look back on some of those and thinking, oh, okay, I can see why this wasn't published now. So all that to say is I love the journey. It's made me who I am right now. It's taught me a lot. And most importantly, I think the most important thing that I'm taking from that journey is the ability to share what I've learned with others.
Yeah. Well, so you went from, if I'm hearing you, you went from sort of writing, it was aspirational, it was more personal to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You were getting, let's say, the practical major. You were maybe going to go into marketing, into business.
Oh,
You
I was
had
going to
the,
be a fashion designer. I wanted to go into
so also
I,
artistic. All right.
fashion design. I like to. I like to sew. I did a lot of sewing. I'm making like my um, prom dress in high school. My grandma could sew. My mom could sew, and I just thought fashion design. So this is a very important point because it's what you're. It sometimes it comes down to what you are exposed to as a child. See, keeping in mind, perhaps if I had a lot of writers around me at the time, or people that were encouraging that, then it would have been different. Because I always loved to write, and I was just had journal, well, not journals, but I would just write little essays and things throughout elementary school and high school. My English teacher said, "Oh, you're great," and my English teacher did tell me, "Whatever you go into," this is when I graduated. She said, "Whatever field you go into, you should write." And I was like, "I'm going into fashion design." She said, "Well, you should be a fashion writer, really." And I was thinking, I don't think she really understood. I didn't understand what that was. Um,
Yeah.
it was years later before I would really understand the prominence of Black writers. I just wasn't aware. So fashion design was it for me until I really decided, no, I don't really like shopping. I don't really like the whole fashion design thing. So I decided to go into marketing. That I would be a buyer, and then still writing short stories for myself. But then when I saw and read Baldwin, it took me on this journey to learn more about Black authors, other than Richard Wright, which I think is the only one that I had really been exposed to. Some of his Native Son and things of that nature that didn't grab me as Baldwin did. Um, so so that's how it went. And now, when though I landed on writing, it never ever wavered. Never. I've been on a steady course, not always knowing what I was doing, but I knew that's what I wanted. I knew that writing would be, and it was going to be in the picture somewhere.
So you studied sort of acknowledgments, you looked at what other writers were doing, your world was sort of opened to the precedent that Black writers had set, and you figured out that you had this community to participate in, and you decided an MFA was really kind of a structured way to do that. You saw that as sort of a career building step for you.
I saw it as a career building step. I saw it as, because of the people that I was reading at the time. This is what they've done. I was looking for a blueprint, perhaps. Now there's so much that perhaps MFA or not, it could go either way. But at that time, and not having the structure, not knowing anyone who was an author, and able to reach out to hundreds of authors online at any given time, I just didn't have that. So the MFA was a way for me to stay connected, and I had such a up and down journey, just financially finishing my undergraduate degree, that this offer, based on short stories that I had written, um, to go for 2 years, and just everything is taken care of. I was honored to do that.
That's amazing, and such a gift.
It,
And
it is. It really was. It was a time that I learned, and I keep in mind, when I really locked on to creative writing, I also got a minor in African American studies because I launched myself into English, and I'm thinking, oh yeah, now I'm gonna, and then I'm sitting there reading old English, and I'm sitting there feeling really disconnected, Chaucer, yeah, that's great for other people, but it made me, I was at a distance. I was back to where I was before, and I'm thinking, wait a minute. So then I had to change my minor to African American Studies, and so even though whatever they threw at me with Shakespeare, some good, some bad, and all the others, because keep in mind when you don't have the community around you that is normally I was the only African American in my workshops, only African American here, there, when I went to these conferences, that I needed that to really say, this is what I can do. These are the people that have done it before, because it's just not, you may, if what you've seen is always people that look like you, then you don't understand that. I'm thinking, I want to write, and I know there has to be more than Baldwin out there, and I had to have those doors open for me. And now, my gosh, what I've found is just amazing.
Well, now we have, I mean, publishing is very slowly having a craniorectal extraction, if you will, of representing diverse creators, diverse voices on the shelves, representing the larger world that we all live in, giving people those opportunities to have a seat at the table that they should have had many, many, many years ago. But at the time when you were coming up, I can appreciate that you needed to see what was possible. You needed to see that blueprint. You needed to see other people who look like you, who sound like you, who have the stories that you have to tell, that context, to see that represented in the larger world, to know that it was possible.
Right, to write the stories. Now, keep in mind, I'm very fortunate to have a family. My family is very good at oral storytelling. That's what we do, around the dinner table. So I had that ear for a good story, and I use that today because that is what I think most of my stories, dialogue is my thing. Just listening to people talk and appreciating that my grandparents had maybe second, third grade education, but they could tell a story. They could hold you with a story. And some of us, we can get MFAs, but that, what it takes to hold a person to a story, to really capture a character, um, we really have to hone that.
I have like 7 questions for you. So I I would love to sort of talk about kind of the things that you learned in your MFA program in a different category, in short story and literary fiction, how you apply it to your work now. But so after your MFA, you actually went and taught. So these elements of a good story, not only have you experienced them, not only do you apply them to your own work, you teach people, you teach other writers how to tell stories.
I absolutely love being a creative writing. I was assistant professor of creative writing. Actually, with the MFA program, I earned a lectureship. Our lectureship is after you do your 2 years, they give you like another 2 years to work on your craft and teach. So that, developed my skills at teaching, and really having that access to students to show them what I knew, as well as just give them that encouragement that, hey, if you want to write, this is what you can do. And I was happy that now I was that writer that another African American person could see, or just someone who really just didn't know that a novelist is something to aspire to, because I was teaching still, but still understanding that I wanted to do both. It was going to be this. I was going to write and teach, or I was just going to write. It was never going to be, I'm going to teach and never write. Um, because people would tell me, oh, when you've been here, because I was on a tenure track. Oh, when you've been here and you've tenured, that writing thing, you'll forget about that. I'm thinking, and people do, and a lot of people do. They just say, hey, I have a good job. That was just a dream I had. I vow never to do that. Because I think sometimes maybe if it was just something it wasn't dyed in the wool like it was with me, then they could give it up and still teach and be happy. Or, and unfortunately we see this a lot, they're secretly like disgruntled and miserable, and they really wish they had stuck to it. Now they're taking it out on students. They're not giving students everything that they need. So we don't want that. So, so
No.
I just knew that I was going to write. I said, well, I will let the teaching go before I let my dream of being a writer, author go. And eventually that's what happened. I did step away from teaching. I could have stayed perhaps and published. Not everyone can do that and give students what they need 100%. Some people can do it, and I love the ones that do. I have several colleagues, friends that do it very well. They publish, top tier and still teach. I mean, Morrison does it, or did it. So it can be done, but everyone can't do it, especially if you're teaching comp and you're grading, 40 essays, a class period. So
That's a lot.
it is.
Yeah. So you were teaching, you had this lectureship, you had on the one hand this idea like, oh, you have this great job, it's writing adjacent, you have this security. Where were you in your quest for publication at that point? Did you step away from teaching because you felt like you were racking up publication credits? Were you getting closer on your novels? Where was your writing at that point?
Oh, I was working on novels and I was getting rejected left and right, like just rejection. That I have, and I have perhaps every single rejection I've ever received. Even the ones that even before, yeah, I have all the ones on email. It may be more than 200 or so. So that is, where I was with just being rejected, which taught me just to endure, to stay in there, which takes me back to one of my quote that I'll paraphrase from Baldwin that says, you will have, people have talent, they could be a genius, but it's the endurance and the discipline, that will keep you on your quest to be a writer. So I think while I was teaching, I would get up at 5, which I still do today, and write. So I would do 8 o'clock classes because I'm a morning person. I'm bubbly in the morning. I would get up at 5. I would write, and then I would have my 8 o'clock classes, and maybe one or two after that. And that's the way it went. So, but none of those. I think I did three novels that were not published, unpublished.
Okay.
Then I experienced a family tragedy. We lost one of my younger brothers. And so when I dealt with that, this was like in, 2010, 2012, that changes everything. And I personally kind of don't talk about that much because it's too emotional still. Sometimes I do, and I'll start crying and all that. So, but I just wanted to tell people that, something happens and you just say, wait a minute, I'm not giving everything I need, because I didn't take a sabbatical or anything. I tried to come back to teaching, and and I was on my way to one of my classes, and I believe it was my brother's spirit that said, hey, are you here? Are you giving students what they need? And honestly, it was draining me, and I knew that I probably wouldn't be able to do it. And so I resigned. And I just walked into, and I think when something hits you, it hits you. And it's just like what happened with Baldwin. when that thing says you have to resign, I was in Missouri at the time at Lincoln University in Jefferson City, Missouri. I resigned. I just, after that class, I went to my department head and said, I'm resigning. He's like, you know, I'm like, I just know in my spirit, I need to walk away. 2 years later, Forever This Love Light Sky. So I do think it was a sibling, and that was the first time. Now, okay, it wasn't the first time that a middle grade voice came to me, because if you look at some of my MFA thesis, these characters, believe it or not, are secondary characters in my MFA thesis. But never would I have thought to put them at the forefront of to have that voice carry the story. So it was literally this 10 11-year-old girl, and she's like, I can do it, I can do it, I can be the voice of this. I'm really, I tell people that, and they think I'm like, this voice was like, put me in, coach type thing, where you're always making me the secondary character. It comes to trusting your voice, trusting those voices that come to you, and not trying to write to market, or be the next this person or this person. Trust the voices that come, which circles us back to why I particularly don't want, I kind of shy away from being pigeonholed, because a voice may come to me that's outside of middle grade. I would have to follow that.
So this is very, very interesting. You have now you've written more. Obviously, you wrote your thesis, maybe one of those other novels that is on a hard drive somewhere. Maybe will stay there, maybe not.
They're all here. Everyone's still on the hard drive. I look at them sometimes.
They're hanging out with your rejection letters, reminding you of how far you've come, So these are, and then you have your two novels that are now published, and they're in the same world. Is it a sequel? Is it a continuation? So you've come at these characters a couple of times. First with your thesis, and then you gave them a run at kind of top billing in your middle grade. How do you decide that there are more stories to tell in this world? How do you sort of now chunk out those stories into separate books? How do you make those decisions?
Well, I think for my third book, chances are, well, I know for a fact the third book, these characters are on hiatus. So I'm
Okay.
probably going to, I know that I'm working on totally different characters, totally different setting. So it'll give them a break. But I know that there's more to tell, because like I said, when you are a writer, like, many of the people who are listening to us are, the character is always talking to you, and it's your job to just come in, write, tell the story you want to tell at the time. And when you fleshed out characters, so I think that you can rejoin them, and where they are at the moment, or where they would be when you look in on them again. So I don't ever close out a character like this character is done. The character to me is a living and breathing person in my mind, and hopefully when readers read it, they feel that way. So when you take that approach, that I am, to the best of my ability, creating fleshed out characters that are just carrying on with their lives, so to speak, when I'm away from them as the creator. When I pick back up, I know that I can reconnect to them. And I think that's why you have some writers who can give you, 6, 7, novels, and you're still like, ooh, what's next? So hopefully these characters will be that for me. But I am going to go to some other characters as well.
So, for those of us who maybe can't channel characters sort of whole from the universe or wherever it is that they live, I love that. By the way, I love the idea of just listening to intuition and just sort of tuning in. I think all of us need to take more time to do that.
Hmm.
especially right now. Everybody's running around stressed out. There's so many personal and global stressors on all of us. And
Right,
I think
right.
that people are just like running roughshod over their intuition and their inner voices. But so you strike me as a writer who can tune in when you are in a place where you can tune in and you do sort of open your inner heart, your inner ear, to those voices. How do you then take that and shape it into a character that people want to follow? You seem to lead with character first. That's what we've mostly talked about.
I'm definitely a character driven writer. There's plot
Yeah.
driven writers and there's character driven. And I'm a character. If I don't have a character that I can, connect to, then I'm not going anywhere. So I really just think of it because I'm a people watcher and because I hear stories and all these stories are about people. And I really believe that my job as a writer is uh, to bring these people to life and to tell whatever story I believe they want to tell. That's the only way that I can explain it, is to really go into it with, what do you think this character would want to say? And I think sometimes we get in trouble when we're wondering what the world wants to read. And I know it's important, and I know that you have to think of marketability somewhere down the line. But if that's your drive, if that's when you're sitting down, like, oh, I know this will, then you may only reach a character that may be hot at that moment, but doesn't have any longevity for you as a writer, because you didn't honestly create that person or that character. So I think when I think of these characters, I really just think of characters that I would want to visit, you know, 5, 10 years in the future to see how they are.
And what is it that you think draws you to them, to this idea of this emotional truth? The character is speaking to you. It's something that you connect with. Is it their hopes and dreams, their ambitions? Is it what they want and need? Is it their relationships and kind of how they function interrelatedly with other characters and sort of the life that springs from that? What elements do you find yourself most drawn to exploring?
I think I'm exploring relationships with others. Relationships is a big one because all of the characters, sometimes I know once I wrote a story called Poor Girl's Palace. I think it was published, well, it was published in the Indiana Review. And the editor wrote back, hey, there's a lot of characters here, because I love characters, and sometimes, maybe I have too many. And he says this reads more like a novel. And I was like, well, that's a good thing, sort of. But I think I'm always curious how my characters relate. And so I have to develop another character. So at what point it becomes, okay, Leslie, you can't have you have too many characters, and then one of my professors said, hey, that's not a bad problem to have. You just have to know how to understand that sometimes you have to pull back and just work with the ones that you have. And it may be like someone else, they have all these beautiful and interesting plot points where I'm struggling with that, but and I'm just working. Well, I'm still on the character, so I have to kind of balance. And you just can't have characters; you have to have plot. But as a character driven writer, I love developing characters. That's probably one of my favorite parts of writing.
I think this can sometimes be a piece of feedback that middle grade writers, especially, run into, which is that a coming of age story. It's like, okay, well, what else? What else is going on? And have you ever heard feedback like that? Like, oh, okay, these are interesting characters. They're coming of age in front of our eyes. What else is going on here?
I've never heard that actually, because if anything, I have too much going on. I have like another subplot because I want everyone to live out what and to do what I think they need to do in the story. So sometimes I have the coming of age of the protagonist, what they're focused on, but then I have these 2 and 3 subplots. So I don't think I've run into that. If anything, it's like there's so much going on. What is the main theme here? Something of that
You
nature.
say you're not a strong plotter, and yet now I'm hearing about just subplots coming out of the woodwork.
It's really following the relationships. It's following that this person wants to live out this particular dream, or this person wants to connect with this person. So when you build it first on character, plot comes. Plots will definitely come. It's just not where I start, but follow an interesting person around, they're going to get into some stuff. So if your characters are interesting, if your characters like human beings, we sometimes, we just get into, sometimes we get into trouble. Sometimes, we fall into different things, fall in love, fall out of love. And with middle grade, sometimes you don't have to look very long before there's trouble or there's something else. So when you create a character that you want to follow, trust me, they're going to run into an obstacle. And then there's the plot.
So relationship, obstacles, the fancies of the human heart, right?
Right, and connecting with parents. Of course, for middle grade, it's more so bullying, and then there's, maybe small crushes, but then there's how do they relate to family drama? How do they relate when parents split? How do they deal when their best friend has to leave the state? How do they deal with failure? So within that, they get themselves in and out of troubles or situations, or even find out what makes them happy. That's even, that's a lot. How do, when you're just coming of age and you realize what makes you happy, and how do they show up in the world? How do they show up? How do they best live their life?
I think that's an amazing additional point when we talk about character. They're still individuating themselves.
Mm-hmm.
They have no idea about some of these things. They are making bold decisions, and one day it's one decision, another day it might be a different decision. But just what lights them up is something that I don't think I've talked to anybody about it as a character consideration.
Because I don't think we do it a lot. We don't think about that at middle grade, because I don't know if often we pay attention to that at that, with kids of that age, because we usually think it's things. It's when usually it may not be. So when you're developing characters and you're character centered, you look for those things. What brings this character joy at this age? And that has been something that I have found that really keeps me connected to my characters and learning them as I write.
What have been those drivers that you've found for your main characters, just out of curiosity?
Well, one of the drivers is really for Love Like Sky. This is for Love Like Sky. I think one of the drivers for this is my first novel. She's dealing with her parents splitting and trying to deal with a new stepmom, and trying to find her place, and trying to navigate that experience. And she's trying to be the best big sister she can for her little sister, which brings her joy, or which. But then she's trying to wrestle with the fact that even though she loves her little sister, she sometimes finds her irritating as well. So am I still a good big sister if I find my little sister irritating? All of these things are going on with her. But what I really think the driver for that story is her trying to figure out what this divorce means. And that's big, because adults don't usually know. So, and then they have a habit of looking they understand, that the kids are going to react to it, but they don't really know how. And
Yeah.
also, they also kind of talk over them. And I think one of my mentors told me, which is, I think we learn this as we go, that kids are usually smarter than we give them credit for. They pick up things. They're uh, way more than we give them credit for. So I try to walk that line in my stories, where I try to make sure that I'm not writing down to my
Yeah.
readers, and so that helps me a lot, and that really helps drive my stories, because I'm not writing down, and I'm having them confront issues head on.
And do you find, so you're sort of observing your characters, you're following them around with a notepad. Have you injected any of your personal experiences growing up into your fiction, or does it exist sort of outside of you?
No, never, no, never personal, never. No, I'm just teasing.
I was going to say, well, that I have never heard before.
Yeah, wouldn't I love to say that? I don't know. I would love to meet that writer. I would love to. I mean, what would be the fun in that? I don't understand that. I mean, I can't imagine that. Um, of Sometimes this life that we live, to me, if you're not taking it and you're not helping someone by putting what you've learned in the story or sharing it, I mean, where does it go? So to me, yes, I do. I'll just tell you, particularly, say for instance, in Love Like Sky, my first novel, the sister has meningitis, the baby's sister. I mean, that's not giving away the plot. That's just, it's in the back of the book. So she has meningitis, and growing up, my sister had meningitis, spinal meningitis. And now, what happens though, and what I figured out, and sometimes writing is, people say write what you know. We've heard that adage before. And sometimes it's like, what we have to keep in mind, sometimes we write what we don't know. We write how we wish things could have gone, and we travel that road with writing. But I remember when my sister was, struck with meningitis, I was very young and she was younger. And I just remember, I wake up, we have these twin beds, and her bed was empty. And we've always been in the same bedroom, and she's always been over there. For her bed to be empty was the scariest thing. And no one talked to me about it, because my mom, everyone was so focused, of course, on um, making sure she was okay. They were at the hospital. And as a child, they didn't think that they were so busy parenting, and they didn't think that, oh my gosh, we need to, walk her through this as well. So in my novel, I take that on and say, wow, we have to talk about this fear, because there's another kid out there that has a ailing sibling, and maybe this book will help them walk through it. So that's just one of the things I put in. Now, totally, I had to research meningitis. I don't remember anything from then, but guess what? I remember the emotion. I remember that fear. That never goes away. And so that's in the book, from me. Um, I didn't have any of these divorce discussions. My mom was a single mom, and this girl, Georgie, my character, she has the love of two dads, a stepdad and her biological father. So everyone thinks that's my experience, but it's not. The things that people think are my experience in the book aren't. Like, nobody thinks that my sister had meningitis. People think, oh, you had two dads growing up. I'm like, no, didn't have a relationship with my biological father. They're like, well, how can you write about a biological father and daughter if you've never experienced that? Because I wanted to imagine how it would be. And so that's when you're writing to something that maybe you wanted to experience or you wanted to know. So that's something too. So a lot of my I wouldn't say, of course, not the majority, because a lot of it is, of course, is fiction, is fictionalized. But yeah, I always put a little something of me in the books. And Forever This Summer, my second book here
Yeah.
is actually the setting is Bogalusa. The first for Love Light Sky is set in Atlanta, but this one is set in my actual hometown of Bogalusa, Louisiana. So there, right there, is something that I wanted to do.
So as we wrap up here, I am struck by your colleague delivering the James Baldwin volume into your hands and sort of setting you on a path. And now you're in this position to create community and to engage other writers. And you are now in that position to sort of reach out, and who knows who you can influence, who knows who you can make community with, and empower in your own right. How is that? Is that something that you feel like you're taking on?
Definitely. I love to take it on. I love to visit schools, talk to young kids to make sure that they know and they can say, even as young as 6, 7, 8, they've seen an actual published author, a African American published author. Is one thing to see them on the internet. Is one thing to talk to one and to have one there. So I take that on. I'm always open to talk to people online about the process. And I know we probably went a little into my whole character driven thing. I just want to make sure that we talked some craft issues as far as,
Yeah.
like I write in the mornings. I don't necessarily write every day, but every day I'm thinking about writing. I'm doing something writerly, as they say. So, but I don't necessarily have to write every single day. But most days I do, 95% of the time I'm writing. And then you have to understand, if you self-publish versus, traditional publish, learn both is what I would say. And I'm a fan of not boxing yourself in with that as well. I've so far I've only traditionally published, but who knows, in the future I may self-publish. It has come a long way since 10 or 12 years ago. So, but people don't understand, when you've been on the if you were teaching at one point, the odds of you even thinking about publishing at that time were slim. You know, it didn't count for tenure. So it wasn't that you're in this ivory tower where you don't appreciate people who self-published. It just wasn't, you didn't even think about it because it didn't count as tenure. I don't know if that's changed. So so
The barriers to entry are so much lower. The barriers to marketing are a lot higher. The legitimacy barrier, I would say, I don't know insofar as a master's program tenure. I'm not sure. I would still say that independent publishing has its own legitimacy issues and also like self-validation issues as well. But it is such a path that for certain categories, especially, makes so much sense for writers to take. And to your point, yes, you've traditionally published these two projects, but for a different category, maybe for a different project, you might find yourself taking that route.
I think people shouldn't count it out. And if I'll tell you this, once do not count on once traditionally published, always traditionally published. That's not the case. You are really only as hot as you are that first 3 or 4 months your book is out. So we can have a whole nother
We could have had a whole different conversation about sales numbers. No, I mean, what I love about your bio, and we didn't even get a chance to talk about what we should have been talking about this entire time, which is the TV show Shark Tank. Um, you love to see people kind of at the top of their game. But what I think is really interesting about this little aside that you've gotten into is that at the top of your game can look like so many different things.
at the top of your game. You know, one person's top of their game is not the other person's top of the game. And I do think that as a writer, if your top of the game is only the New York Times bestseller list, not saying it can't happen, and goodness knows it would be great if it happened for me. But if that is the only thing how you are going to define your success, that is a long road to hoe, as my grandma used to say. You have to find, there's so many other joys and plateaus that sometimes we don't look at those. It's only success if you hit the New York Times bestseller list. It's only success if you're doing this. And we miss the things that we've talked about here: encouraging others, being a role model for others. Many more people will be what they call mid-list writers than they will be New York Times every time you put a book out writers. So where do you find your happiness? Is your joy in the craft, or is your joy in just only hitting that plateau? My joy is in the craft and writing the books and telling the stories. If the New York Times bestseller happens, great. But you have to find your joy in this process, because publishing is pretty cruel. I mean, it really is.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I have writers who come to me because you have to write a complete manuscript of a novel to get consideration for a literary agent in most cases. So you have to do the whole thing, the whole sweaty work of writing a complete manuscript. And I've had writers be like, well, if I don't get an agent after all that, it was for nothing.
Oh my goodness.
I just want to tell those writers, I'm like, if you're not getting anything from the actual writing process, if it's so only goal oriented, to your fabulous point, you're going to have a tough time. I'm just going to be honest. You're going to have a tough time.
Like I said, I had 3 or 4. There would probably be. Now, keep in mind, there's always lightning in the bottle. There's always a writer that comes along, their first novel, they're millionaires. It happens. I know these people. They're on my bookshelf. I know them personally. It happens. So please don't think it doesn't. I'm not a naysayer. It doesn't. But is that the norm? No. The norm is maybe it's your first, second, third book before you even land an agent. That's the reality of it. For me, it was my 4th completed manuscript before I landed an agent. Would I take any of those novels back? No. I've learned something from every one. So, and I love what I do. I love the act of putting words on the page. That's what I love. So I'm doing what I love. You just have to get to the point where doing what you love and you're making the money to sustain. Because right now, it's working, but most of the time it doesn't work. I was working at the post office not too long ago, just making ends meet. We can have another podcast about that. There's things that you do, and if you're not willing to do those things, everyone wants it right now, and that's not how it happens in most cases. And we didn't even talk. I don't know if we have time. Remember, we were going to talk about being from Hyperion to Little Brown.
So you had a publisher change. So I think Love Like Sky was acquired by Disney Hyperion. Disney Hyperion went through some changes. Their list was bought by Little Brown Books for Young Readers. That's who issued Forever This Summer. So you've had some ups and downs in terms of even the publishing home that you thought you had.
Right. When I first landed my agent, like I said, it took me years and years and years. But when I wrote this novel, I wrote it in probably a year and landed an agent in just a few months. That's how it happens.
Amazing.
That's how it happens sometimes. But people hear that, but they don't know about the 10 years I spent being rejected. So landed the agent, wrote the book, published with Disney Hyperion. Everything was going well. But Disney, this is realistic fiction. That's what I write. And Disney is mostly known for fantasy, magical realism. So Disney decided to cut back on their realistic fiction titles and strictly focus mostly on their trademark. And one day I just woke up and I received this email that says, "Welcome to Little Brown." I'm like, what? I was just working. I mean, it really happened Um, I was working with the editor at Disney maybe 2 or 3 days before. We were working on Forever This Summer, and a couple days later, it was Welcome to Little Brown. That's how it happens. Fortunately for me, I have a very happy ending because everything flowed so smoothly. I mean, I didn't they didn't miss a beat. I had an agent, I mean, I had my publicist, I had another editor, and things carried on. But sometimes I've heard that could be a really big issue. But anyway, just that's just one example of how things change with publishing. You never know. I've had in the course of completing for Love Like Sky, like two editor. No, I never had an editor change for that book, but I did have an editor change, of course, going into Forever This Summer. So you just never know. You just have to be attached to your work and love what you do.
And I think that that has been more or less your story, whether you were officially pursuing writing, but you called yourself a dyed-in-the-wool writer. That's just always been what you come back to when it comes to this craft.
That is it. And that's it, Mary. And at the end of the day, I am truly fortunate that I found my passion, that I found my calling, and everything else from here is just sharing what I know and also just staying true to what I do and writing more books.
Leslie, yeah, right, and writing more books.
Writing more books, there's so much, and making and I'll just end on this. I have these little posters, handwritten posters around my home, and it says "Stay aligned." Just stay aligned, because sometimes I think we get ourselves out of alignment where, I'm doing this and I should be focused. So the ideal of staying aligned and staying in my craft and just staying focused with that is it helps. So just stay aligned, stay focused. And I think that I think you can apply that to pretty much everything.
I think a lot of people are just trying to stay alive at this point. It's a beautiful reminder to stay aligned.
Stay aligned,
aim for that just a slightly higher level when it comes to yourself and your writing. And that's clearly been working for you.
Well, thank you, Mary. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful just story you've told us about yourself, about your work. I think that we need to, so this was the warm and fuzzy craft focused interview. I think we need like down to basics, like business interview where we just ruin everybody's dreams of the publishing process.
That's pretty much, like I said, sometimes I'm so emotional about this thing and I love it so much that I have a tendency, unless, you have this list of questions, I'll just get off into, because it's just what I've been doing for so long. And, but people, they come at it with, I want it now. I'm like, really? Do you? Oh, okay. That's not usually how it happens. They don't want to do the work.
And that's, when people, I talk about, I mentioned Shark Tank, but you see somebody up on that stage, you see their like 2-minute performance, right? You see their pitch and you're like, oh man, they just got up on TV, reality TV. Reality TV has ruined everybody's sense of craft and hard work and perseverance and the time it actually takes to do something. They just see the American Idol edition. They don't see the voice lessons and the dance training and all of the stuff that went into that one pinnacle moment.
Interesting, because those are The Voice and Shark Tank, as in some comedies, are usually it for me for TV, because I love Shark Tank, because I understand what it takes to be just like you, to be there. And they're going for their dreams and they spent years in most cases coming up with this. So I love watching Shark Tank for that reason. And I love watching The Voice, because they're like, here's my shot. And that's how it is with writing. Here's my shot. They shoot you down sometimes and sometimes not. But that's how I look at it. Those, when I'm on my writing breaks, I watch Shark Tank. I do.
I love it. I watch it for the business advice. Like when Kevin O'Leary's like, but how does it make
Yeah,
money?
how
I'm
does
like,
it
yeah,
make money?
Brenda.
I
Yeah,
love
Brenda,
that.
how does it?
Yeah, I like that. I like it for the fact that they can stand up there and take the critique, which is people need to learn. You have to learn how to take critique. You have to do that well, and then you have to be. You have to go for your dreams, which is at the end of the day what writing is about. You're going for your dreams. You're putting it on the line, and even if they say no, you're going to stick with it, and you're going to do it
Yeah,
anyway. So then you have to have all of that. And the same with the voice. You have people just putting their, putting not themselves, but actually their stories. When we tell our stories, we're putting it out there for the world. And then there's a whole nother podcast about how do you deal with criticism? How do you deal when the book, is not doing as well as you thought? How do you do when it's doing, so much goes into this. So I think that's what people need to understand. And is never just the warm and fuzzy. It's never just the overnight success, because there is no such thing. In most cases. Well, even people that I know who got like 7-figure deals, it's still not overnight. Maybe it wasn't 15 years, but it still wasn't overnight. So all of that good stuff. And I've paid for editors out of my pocket. I've learned hard lessons with that. Just so many things, um, that you really have to take in consideration. I paid for editors too early. Um,
yeah.
Never did I not have an editor though, because I believe in the importance of that. Once you've done the best that you can do, some people don't believe in getting someone to help you take it to another level. I believe in that, sharpening your work. So all of that good stuff.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. I do feel like we could talk for hours and
We
hours.
can, we got so much to
And
say. So
maybe we will. Maybe we'll do a part two for kind of nitty gritty author
yeah,
consideration.
we can do that. And keep in mind, I have other work coming out. There's also another good topic to talk about, which is outside of the novels. I have really opened myself up, which is something that I didn't think that I would do, to doing like collaborations, because you have to keep the
Yes.
lights on. You have to understand this vision as a writer, especially when you're working to be 100% full-time writer. It takes a lot more, because everybody thinks, with 2 books, oh, some people in my family, I'm sure they think that I'm rich now, you know. But people don't understand there's the payment structure for publishing. There's
And they
and not
chop it
you
into as many payments as they can get away
right.
with.
All of that is what we need to talk about. So what do you do when I say stay aligned, I'm talking when I mean it in the sense that, Leslie, you have bills to pay. You don't have another book contract right now, but working at the post office is not where you need to be. So you have to stay aligned. I have to figure out, how do I continue to make money in this field? So I've been working on that, and it's paying off for me.
Thank you so much. Thank you for speaking with us, sharing what you know. Your books are Love Like Sky and Forever This Summer, out from Little Brown Books for Young Readers
Little brown
now.
books.
Little Brown. And just thank you. Thank you for spending this time with me.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you. And hi, everyone with Good Story Company. I look forward to hearing from you.
Yep. Here's to a good story.